Today's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. It's 2 minutes past 8. Joining me on the panel today, to my left, Dr. Ellie Chowns, Green MP for North Herefordshire. To her left, Henry Newman, former advisor to Boris Johnson, who now writes the Whitehall Project newsletter. To my right, Dame Harriett Baldwin, Conservative Shadow Development Minister and MP for West Worcestershire. And to her right, Isabel Hilton, journalist and broadcaster who specialises in Chinese affairs. When I say Chinese affairs, people get the wrong impression there, I think, Isabel.
We'll have to
think of a new way of describing you. She's the founder of the China Dialogue Trust. If you'd like to put a question to our panel, the number to call 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp on the same number or text 84850, and we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, our first question is a WhatsApp question from Faz in Warwick. Is China a partner for trade or a threat to our nation's security? And can it be both? That last bit, I think, that's a really incisive question, actually. With the Foreign Secretary due to travel to China later this week, Rishi Sunak used today's PMQs to ask Sir Keir Starmer if David Lammy will be raising China's dangerous and escalatory acts with authorities in Beijing. Well, Isabel Hilton, I obviously have to come to you first on this.
Well, the answer to the listener's question is that, yes, both. And there's, in fact, everyone, including the UK, the European Union and the United States, when confronted with the conundrum that is China, has come up with a sort of three-word response, which roughly goes compete, collaborate, and challenge, yes, or confront, or anyway, there are variations on that theme, and it's an acknowledgement that the world's second biggest trading economy, the largest producer both of greenhouse gases and renewable kit, quite an important nation, but actually not a nation that's bent on anyone's good but its own. It does sum up those
other nations, actually, in some ways.
Yeah, but not all of them are quite as problematic, actually. And certainly, there's a lot of talk about the new Cold War or the new Cold Wars, as some would have it. And in the old Cold War, we didn't really trade much with Russia. I mean, hardly anything at all. Whereas China has achieved a pretty dominant position in pretty much all the technologies that we're going to need for the energy transition, for example. But many of those have embedded security problems, so connected cars, even actually the sort of chips that are in your fridge are feeding back information. It may not matter for your fridge, but it could matter. I wouldn't want to do that for my fridge, I'll tell you. Well, indeed. But it could matter in a wind turbine, because you're getting information about the grid and the capacity to introduce interference in the grid. So it's all of the above. And that's why, although people have described the conundrum very well, almost no one has a policy.
So what you're effectively saying is that our relationship with China and that of the United States, or indeed any other country, is being governed by realpolitik, where we might want to take a stand, but actually if we do, there are consequences of that.
There are consequences, though China always likes to imply the consequences are greater than they necessarily are. Classic case, the European Union has put tariffs on electric vehicles. China has responded with a series of tariffs on things like brandy and, essentially European luxury goods. Now, apart from the German car industry, which is rapidly losing market share, no other industry or indeed country has a positive trade balance with China. So frankly, it's at the margins at this point. And even the German car industry, as I say, they're losing market share because the Chinese have gone for EVs and they make them better than anyone else. So, I think that I've always felt in these dealings with China that essentially we have to think about our own values and principles. And if we don't defend those and protect those, who else is going to?
Harriett Baldwin, you were a Foreign Office Minister. Was China ever under your part of the Foreign Office?
Not under my part of the Foreign Office, but I think, as Isabel says, you've obviously got to have a dialogue with China. It's a really important country. They're fellow members of, permanent members of the Security Council, and important players, not only in the things that UK consumers buy, but also on a range of different long-term strategic issues. What I do think we need to do in this country is make sure that we do challenge them when appropriate. So, for example, one of the things that Rishi Sunak was asking today was around Jimmy Lai, who is being held wrongly by the Chinese in Hong Kong. And he's a British citizen, and we ought to be challenging those kinds of situations. But obviously we need to be having discussions with China, an important country, and obviously we need also to challenge where appropriate, but trade with them.
Ellie Chowns.
Yes, I mean, as Isabel said, and as the questioner said, it is both. It has to be both. They're definitely a partner for trade, clearly. It's a very unequal trading relationship. It's a very unequal power relationship, frankly, and even more so now that we're outside the European Union, so we're just trying to stand up on our own little selves. I think it's really important.
We're the sixth largest economy in the world.
Yeah,
Why do people always talk down our economy?
Because the market's not big enough.
I think let's just be realistic about our influence on the global stage. And if we're talking about our influence with a country like China, we need to start by recognising it is an unequal relationship. It's certainly unequal in terms of economic power. I think where it is really important is that the UK does stand up for human rights, whether we're defending the rights of peaceful, pro-democracy defenders in Hong Kong, whether we're defending the rights of the Taiwanese not to be subject to all sorts of exercises surrounding them on Monday, whether we're defending the rights of the Uyghurs not to have 1 million of them interned and effectively treated as slave labour, and in what Parliament has unanimously called a genocide. And what that has to mean at the very least is that David Lammy, in going to visit China, needs to stand up for British values of defending those what should be universal principles of human rights. Now, I'm no China expert. I completely defer to Isabel on this, but what I have observed is that China tends to take offence if anybody stands up and challenges them. And I think it is important to stand up for those principles. It is important to say, we need to be treated as an equal partner in diplomatic, political discussions, and these are the things that are important to us, and to ask questions in the same way that we would with any other power. So we always have to have dialogue. We do need to recognise the threats to national security, again, as Isabel has said, and I think we need to be very realistic about that. Sometimes there might have been a bit of wishful thinking over recent years and decades in British engagement with Chinese companies, many of which are state-owned, state-funded, effectively state-driven. We need to recognise the way that politics and economics are completely intertwined in China.
Henry?
I mean, from my point of view, I find that many of the Chinese actions make my blood boil and really worry me. I think we just heard about the Uyghurs, this sort of mass slave labour, human rights violations in Tibet, in Hong Kong, espionage against Britain and all kinds of other countries, threats to Taiwan. It's pretty difficult to advocate for anything other than a very tough position on China. I recognise the size of the Chinese economy. But what worries me is I think there's a degree of naivety. I don't accept Ellie's argument that we're somehow irrelevant, but equally simultaneously we should, the Foreign Secretary should go to China and stand tall on the world stage. Fine, slight contradiction. But I think the thing that worries me is that Ed Miliband has very ambitious plans to transition the economy and to switch to clean power by 2030. Laudable aim. I think we can question how deliverable it really is, and also some of the consequences that would come from that, including an inability to rely on the most stable form of clean power, nuclear energy. But the energy transition, particularly at that pace, will, if we do it in that way, require us to buy enormous amounts of Chinese products. And I don't think we've really reckoned with that as a country. We haven't reckoned with the fact that unlike, we've transitioned away from fossil fuels faster than many of our major competitors, but we've done so in a way that simply hasn't produced jobs here in the UK in the way that I think many of us would have liked to.
Something like 90%
over the last 14 years.
I wouldn't listen to the Green Party about many things, including the energy transition. But I think it really worries me that we're not having this honest debate in the way that Isabel was saying, that China is both one of the biggest emitters of fossil fuels, but also one of the biggest developers of new technologies. And they very strategically cornered the market in rare earth metals, in the development of solar panels and electric vehicles. And that is a risk. And I think we're just, people saying, I want to get to green faster, need to explain to the British people that they're very relaxed about spending a huge amount of money buying Chinese products, and with all the security threats that Isabel was outlining, they might come with.
Just to be clear, that the Chinese capacity to manufacture at scale has brought down the price of solar panels, for example, by 85%.
But potentially,
are they slave labour? Is it slave labour though?
No, I think on solar panels, I think that's very hard to prove, to be honest.
Hard to prove.
No, well, look, if you really want to get into Chinese supply chains and the question of slave labour, it's never going to stop, because those Uyghurs have been distributed across the country, and you should stop eating tin tomatoes and maybe stop wearing cotton. So, if we're going to talk about...
I think my tin tomatoes come from Italy, but...
No, actually, Xinjiang is one of the major producers of tomatoes, which go into tins, sometimes in Italy.
Really?
Yes.
Well, we've learned something new tonight.
I mean, it is largely complicated.
Let's take a follow-up call from Paul in Dublin. Paul, hi, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian and panel. Huge fan of the show. I don't think there's enough talk about... I've been listening to the very good discussion by the panel there this evening. I don't think there's enough talk about the, I believe, imminent, and I call it a threat, of Xiaoping saying he's going to take Taiwan back. If and when that happens, it'll put the Ukraine war into the penny halfpenny league. And I just think that we're glossing over a lot of stuff here. I think he has stated that he wants it back. If that were to happen, I think we know the ramifications.
Okay, well, let's put that to the panel, Paul. Now, the Chinese military conducted drills on Monday, which involved surrounding the entire island of Taiwan. It's believed that these were a response to the Taiwanese President William Lai vowing to resist annexation. Again, Isabel, let me come to you first.
Well, the Chinese, whatever William Lai had said in his his National Day speech, the double 10th, the Chinese would have reacted like this because they don't like the DPP. The DPP are a native Taiwanese party, unlike the KMT, the Kuomintang, who came from the mainland, having lost the Civil War. So the DPP essentially have a position that Taiwan is Taiwan, and it's not the Republic of China. It's really, and it was never a province and all of that. And certainly on the historical, I mean, if you really want to argue the history, the Chinese case is very thin. However, the political case is that Xi Jinping has bet his place in history on the quote-unquote recovery of Taiwan. Now, the exercises that they did were partly a sort of, we'll show you DPP, watch yourself, don't go any further. But they were also a sort of demonstration that Taiwan is, after all, an island and can be blockaded. So I've tended to think that rather than a full-scale kinetic assault on Taiwan, which would be catastrophic on any number of fronts, that the slow strangulation, and particularly if you bear in mind that Taiwan's energy is mostly imported and seaborne, so that coal, oil and natural gas have to come in by ship, and particularly the LNG, there are really not very many, the stocks are not very deep. So give it a week, 2 weeks, Taiwan will be out of LNG.
So you think blockade rather than invasion?
That's my feeling, because why would you get into a war you don't know you can win, in which your citizens could die, if you have other options? And the Chinese have been very good at those other options.
I would just say, again, that I hope the Foreign Secretary, when he goes to China, raises exactly these points, because, we've got to stand up for this principle that we've stood up for so strongly in Ukraine, which is that the rules-based international order are not invading other territory. But I also was concerned to hear
it's their territory. That's
exactly,
the problem, isn't it?
But again, I think it's so important that Russia not be allowed to succeed in Ukraine, because it would set a terrible example to all sorts of different, perhaps not exactly similar things. But if I can just make the other point in terms of the Foreign Secretary, there are stories saying that the Taiwanese president had wanted to come to the UK and has been discouraged from coming to the UK, and I think that would be very bad news. I think, as we've heard from others on the panel, you've got to stand up to bullies and say, well, we'll allow whoever we want to come into this country, and we're not going to bow to that kind of pressure.
I think one of the interesting things here is I remember in the weeks building up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would interview Ukrainians on the programme, say, oh no, it'll never happen. And I've got friends in Taiwan who keep saying, well, it'll never happen, China will never do it. But
it's a lesson.
But the other thing is that if you live under that threat, what can you do?
I was going to say, I think it's a lesson that sometimes you have to listen to what dictators are actually saying. And I think if you're hearing very clearly that the Chinese state's proclamations about Taiwan, they're very honest about what they want to do. And I think there's a tendency oftentimes to dismiss what political leaders that we don't agree with say, and there's sometimes all kinds of analysts and used to work on the Middle East, and people will try to interpret what people are saying, and we should actually listen to the real words they're saying. If we listen to Putin more carefully, he was very clear about what he wanted to do in Ukraine. But I completely agree with Harriett that the crucial thing here is that the near conflict at the moment is with Ukraine, and standing with Ukraine in the way that we are is so important to making sure that China doesn't feel enabled or permitted to do things that it might want to do otherwise in Taiwan.
Ellie, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the original question, I do think Xi Jinping is serious about taking Taiwan, and I do think that's worrying. And at the same time, I can completely see that if you live in that country, then just psychologically to live with the idea, oh, I might be invaded tomorrow, that you have to keep going with normal life. I've worked in a conflict zone myself. I know normal life continues. It's really quite extraordinary, even in a period of active conflict. I think that recognising that Xi Jinping is very clear that he wants to take Taiwan, and again I would kind of just reflect back gently to the caller who talked about kind of retaking Taiwan. It's not a kind of retaking, as Isabel said. The historical justification is really very, very, very thin, and that was, of course, one of the points that was made in the speech last week, which has kind of prompted what is one in quite a long line of these sorts of examples of exercises and so forth. Okay. There is quite a lot of sabre rattling that China does. The question is, how do we know when it becomes serious, like a precursor to a Russia-style invasion of Ukraine? And then if anybody knew that, they would have a crystal ball.
Okay. Paul, great question. Thank you very much indeed. We'll move on to other subjects in just a moment. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Whitehall.
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
8:20 on LBC. We have Conservative MP Dame Harriett Baldwin with us, Green MP Dr. Ellie Chowns, Henry Newman, who writes the Whitehall Project newsletter, and Isabel Hilton, founder of the China Dialogue Trust. Text question from Imogen in Manchester. Do you welcome the Archbishop of Canterbury intervening in the assisted dying debate today, or should he save his views for his Sunday sermons? Now, with the law proposing legalising assisted dying being introduced to Parliament today, Justin Welby has warned that passing this bill could be a slippery slope. I would think that's the laziest of arguments, and you have to have a better argument to deploy than that if you're going to try to defeat this bill. Ellie Chowns, what do you think?
I think there are probably three things that I'd want to say in response to this. I don't at all mind Justin Welby putting his voice into the debate. In fact, it's really important that he does. It's important that all of us have as considered and compassionate and open a conversation about this crucial issue as possible. And so it is completely legitimate for him as the Archbishop of Canterbury to contribute to that debate, and he's entirely entitled to his view. This is actually quite relevant to a debate we had yesterday in the Commons about the abolition of hereditary peers in the House of Lords. One of the points I made there was that I thought that bishops should not sit in the House of Lords. Indeed, life peers shouldn't sit in the House of Lords.
Well, you're on the same side as both Gavin Williamson and Jeremy Corbyn.
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? But this is, one can have agreement across different party lines. So I think that bishops, all religious leaders and non-faith leaders and all of us are entitled to have a view on this. I happen to disagree with him. I do support the principle of assisted dying. I'm obviously waiting to see the details of the bill, of Kim Lebita's bill that is about to come forward. But I really welcome the fact that this is coming back to the Commons. And I have been so struck, both as a recently elected MP and indeed throughout the general election campaign, how many people, every single person that raised this with me on the doorstep wanted assisted dying. It was so strongly supported in public meetings that I was doing about all sorts of topics. I was asked about this. I shared my views, and people were pretty much universally supportive. So I do think the country is ready for this. I think the country are ahead of MPs, in fact.
We've done a couple of phone-ins on it on this show over the past couple of weeks, and I would say 90% of the callers who actively call in would agree with you on that. I mean, that's just a straw poll. Henry Newman, back to Justin Welby. If the Archbishop of Canterbury can't have a view on this, what can he have a view on?
Exactly. I think I'm not sure I defend hereditary peers per se, but I do think that the hereditary principle is an important part of our constitutional history, including the monarchy, and we should be careful about pulling on these threads. I think religious leaders obviously have an important role to play in talking about these sorts of questions. They are fundamentally at that sort of intersection between social policy and religious questions. Personally, I feel quite uncomfortable about it. I don't think if I was asked to vote on it, I could support it. I think that's also because I just worry that there would be... it's not just the slippery slope argument, and there might be a lazy argument, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not a valid one. But I worry that there would be pressure on people, and I worry that we'd be a few steps away from euthanasia yourself to save the NHS, sort of. I mean, I'm slightly joking, but I think there is truth in it. And I know that a lot of people feel very passionate about this. They've had personal circumstances where they've seen family members really suffering. So I'm kind of cautious about recognising that. And I've got family members who work in the health service and have to deal with end-of-life care, and they also talk about just how difficult that is. So I think it's an important question, and I worry that as well that the way it's being introduced, I know we've used private members' bills before to make major social changes, including, for example, decriminalising homosexuality. That's important. But the way that the Commons works now, it just means that there's going to be very little time for real scrutiny of this legislation. And it's not just about the slippery slope, but it's about getting the balances and the checks wrong. And I worry that I don't really understand why the government has rushed headlong into this, other than the fact that Keir Starmer made a promise to Esther Ransom, which is a nice thing to do, but not really the best way to design public policy.
Harriett.
Well, I mean, first of all, obviously, the Archbishop of Canterbury should be someone who can speak on this issue. Of course he should. In terms of the legislation itself, it will be down to every member of Parliament's individual conscience. When it goes to the Lords, it will also be down to those members to look at it very closely. And my life experience, just like the life experience of many people out there on the doorstep, will inform how I go about voting on this. And in my case, it was that my father was very, very ill, was not given any time to live, was in intensive care then for, I think, something like 3 months. No one thought he would make it out. And he made it out, and he lived for another 20 years and saw his grandchildren grow up. So I wasn't
prepared for a happy ending on that one, I have to say.
No, exactly. And so for me, I question the judgment around even 2 doctors being able to say this person is terminally ill.
I mean, and maybe you don't want to go into this, but if he had had the choice of dying at that point, do you think he would have taken it?
I think the reason he came through was that he was a fighter and he didn't want to die. But I just think that to put the onus on a doctor to say, I think this person only has X months, which I think is going to be in the legislation, and then on a judge to make that judgment. We saw actually in the NHS, Henry sounded as though he was joking about this, die to save the NHS, but actually there was something called the Liverpool Care Pathway that was rolled out.
My mother was put on that without any of us being told about it.
Absolutely, and a lot of people were helped to their end by the NHS. So I actually really can't vote for this legislation. No, you've talked me into it, opposing it. Yeah.
Oh dear. Isabel.
Well, for a start, I think it's in the job description of the Archbishop of Canterbury to intervene. It would be extraordinary if he didn't. What's he for if he didn't? Secondly, I think I'm in favour of this, and I do think the risks can be managed. I appreciate that not all diagnoses and prognoses are not infallible. We know that. But there are some diseases, some illnesses, which take a fairly relentless course. And a friend of mine has been diagnosed with motor neuron disease, and you don't come back from that.
No.
So I think that are certainly cases where people should have the choice of skipping the particularly difficult end bits if they choose.
Sean says, Iain, stop criticising Justin Welby on what you may have heard or read. Get him on the show. Give him a chance to explain his views. I'd love him to come on the show. The last time I interviewed him was 11 years ago. And he's the only person in 14 years of broadcasting who's tried to dictate what questions I could ask.
Oh my goodness.
And to my utter immortal shame, I acceded to his wish.
Oh.
Because he was actually in the building to talk to Classic FM, and I thought, well, if I don't agree to this, he's never going to come in the building again. So I had to be a little bit pragmatic, but I've never forgotten that. You wanted to come in, Ellie?
Oh, I just wanted to respond to something Henry said about, pressure on people to kind of die to save the NHS and things like that. And I think it's so important that we keep this debate on the basis of thoughtfulness and evidence rather than sound bites. And earlier today, I read an article by a man who's been, I think for 6 years, head of a sort of oversight body in Australia where they introduced this. And he was saying that he's reviewed thousands of these cases and there's not been any evidence of coercion in any of them. I think same with Justin Welby was challenged on Newsnight last night because he said it's a slippery slope. And actually, Oregon, for example, it hasn't been a slippery slope for more than 25 years.
But
so
Canada has evolved.
I just think we need to be really, really thoughtful and careful about this. And on the topic of, it's such an interesting story that you told there, Harriett. I mean, my predecessor, I hope he won't mind, I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, he said it publicly, his views changed towards supporting assisted dying because of his own experience with his own father. So I think people change their minds both directions, and that's inevitable. But I think we have to make this decision not just on the basis of the individual cases that we know. I think we have to make this decision on the basis of principles of liberty and choice, also on the basis of how can we relieve
the sanctity
suffering.
of life has always been a key thing in our sort of general society, hasn't it? Whatever your religious views are, sanctity of life has been very important, and this does threaten that.
But this is about people with, as I understand it, the bill will be for people who are terminally ill with up to 6 or 12 months to live. There's another argument or debate to be had about whether it should be extended to those who are unbearably suffering.
You just said it couldn't be
even if
ago.
No, there is another. I think this should be part of our whole debate.
But I think this is the problem. So you said earlier that people change their mind. I've changed my mind myself. I used to actually be quite in favour of this, and I've become, the more I've sort of thought about it, the more concerned I've become. And I slightly resent this implication that I was just making a soundbite point earlier. I think there is a real risk that people feel pressured, not just about the health service, but also about family members becoming a burden. It's something you often hear from elderly relatives. I don't want to be a burden for anybody. And I just think, I just worry that we're not yet in a position where I would like to see the most advanced care system available for the whole public. I think that's something that most cross-party people...
Including palliative care.
Palliative care and everything. And I think none of us would sit here and argue that we have a fantastic care system in place. I just think that, and I think that
Obviously
really is...
not.
Exactly. And it worries me that we're introducing this option for people without the wraparound support that would allow them to think that even if they didn't take that route, they'd be able to live their life in complete dignity.
And another
worry me.
principle I think that should inform this debate, and you make that point well, is that for the medical profession, they sign up to the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm, and I think those doctors helped my father go back and survive for those 93 days in intensive care when he shouldn't really have been kept alive, but he was kept alive and he survived. So I just really I can't bring myself to vote for this.
Just on this though, I mean, my understanding is that there will be provision that no doctor has to be part of an assisted dying process if they don't wish to be. That's I think everybody would accept
but they
that.
do have to sign up to that Hippocratic Oath.
First, do no harm. The question here is, where is the harm? Is it in prolonging life where there is no hope of recovery and potentially considerable suffering and increased pain? Is the less harmful thing to do to allow people with safeguards to choose to end their lives in dignity, surrounded by people that they love at a time and place of their choosing? And so for me, supporting assisted dying is supporting reducing harm.
Well, the debate for this is going to take place on the 29th of November, but I think that is a Friday, and Friday debates, I suspect this will get a big...
It will be huge.
It will be huge. But I think whoever it was who said this maybe ought to be in government time, I think has got a point, because it does need to have scrutiny. Right, we'll move on to some more questions in just a moment, and we will find out what Henry Newman's Whitehall Project newsletter does what it says on the tin, I guess. 8:33 on LBC News Headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The UK is considering sanctioning 2 Israeli ministers over their support for blocking humanitarian aid into Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer confirmed it's looking into the comments made by the country's finance and national security ministers. The Archbishop of Canterbury has warned assisted dying is dangerous and will put the UK on a slippery slope if approved. A bill to allow terminally ill people in England and Wales to end their lives has been introduced in Parliament. And the FA says it spoke to 10 candidates before approaching Thomas Tuchel to be the England men's new head coach. The former Chelsea boss will take over next year. LBC weather, showers pushing northeastwards tonight, will be heavy in places. Rain clearing for most, with some lingering spells in the north by dawn and a low of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36 on LBC. Harriett Baldwin is here, Ellie Chowns is here, Isabel Hilton and Henry Newman. Now, your Whitehall Project newsletter has taken on a bit of a life of its own. Are you surprised by the success of it? Because you seem to be mentioned in the newspapers virtually every day.
I mean, it's not it's a sort of illustrious newsletter as yours, but it's a kind of... what I was trying to do when I left government was talk a bit more about what the civil service, what Whitehall does. It's an incredibly important institution, 500,000 people working for the state, delivering some of our most important public services, welfare, which I think we might be coming on to in a minute, defence, obviously, but also supporting ministers in making decisions and implementing their policies. And I think it's a very opaque institution. We don't really know much about the individuals involved, who they are, who the cabinet secretary is, or the principal private secretary to the Prime Minister, beyond programmes like The Thick of It or Yes Minister, which may be a training programme for ministers or maybe a comedy. And I, as I started writing this blog, I got more surprised by some of the things I was discovering about what the current government was doing and some of the cronyism rows that they've managed to get into. Obviously, a lot of the attention recently has been about tickets and freebies and Taylor Swift, but it's also been about comings and goings and Downing Street and Sue Gray's defenestration, but also about people that the Labour government have brought into office. Of course, all ministers bring people into the civil service with them, but I think they've tried to make some very political people appointed as civil servants into some extremely senior positions. So I've been exposing some of that, and I think it has caught something of the sort of imagination. I would like this government to be doing well. I'm a Conservative and work for Conservative ministers, but I do think there's important questions that they now need to ask about the way that they're handling their civil service interactions and running key bits of the state.
So where do people find it? How can they subscribe?
They can log on to Substack, or they can type into Google the Whitehall Project and find it. I'd recommend it. I did one earlier today about Emily Middleton. She's a woman who was appointed to be a Director General in the Science Department. I think she knows a lot about digital transformation, but she was appointed to the civil service without any competition, despite the fact that she previously worked for the Shadow Secretary of State, and she'd also worked for a company that donated to the Shadow Secretary of State. And I think that is quite a difficult thing to get your head around.
Okay. Right, let's move on to Pauline in Watford. Pauline, very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Hello, Iain, and everyone else. As someone who was hospitalised with mental illness in the past, the last episode in 2004, my question is, do you agree with the Labour government that it is right to send job coaches into psychiatric wards, alleging that the trial of such practices has worked? I want to see the evidence.
OK, interesting question. Well, the Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, claims that trials of employment advisors giving advice on writing a CV and having a job interview in hospital have had dramatic results. This scheme would be part of the efforts to reduce the number of economically inactive people and also reduce annual disability benefit spending. Do I remember rightly that you were a minister at the DWP at one point, Harriett?
I wasn't. I was on the Select Committee for Work and Pensions when I first got elected. I thought, it would be so interesting to see how this is the biggest budgeting government and, how does it work and how do you ensure that it sends the right incentives to people? Because, I happen to think that for most people, work can be not just financially rewarding, but rewarding in the sense that you go in, you meet colleagues, you meet interesting people, you have discussions, you can chat to someone around the water cooler and so on, and that it's part of society to be in the workplace. And I think that you do want to have a welfare safety net that's there for people when they really are unable to either find work or work. But you've also got a responsibility, I think, to help people with a transition back into the workplace. Now, in this example, psychiatric wards, I would like to see the evidence myself, Pauline, but I think the principle of trying to help as many people as possible recontact with the world of work after perhaps a difficult time and make that contribution that makes people value themselves and helps them off welfare, I think is a good thing to do.
I just wonder what the reaction to this would have been had a Conservative government suggested it, because it does seem a very authoritarian thing to do, Isabel.
Well, I rather agree. I think, perhaps after someone has recovered and left a psychiatric ward, there would be more of a case. I mean, the notion of sending someone into a psychiatric ward in order to encourage them to get back into work, I modestly suggest, would send their stress levels even higher. And that was a very idealistic description of work for most people. For a lot of people, work is casualised, alienating, and doesn't pay. And we've endless examples of people whose salaries or wages are so low that they'd be better off on welfare. So I think that there are, a number of ways we can tackle the problem of the welfare bill, partly by stopping subsidising major employers who could perhaps pay decent wages. But the idea that we're going to make any substantial difference to the welfare bill by encouraging people in psychiatric hospitals to work, I think, is for the birds.
Henry?
Well, I think I haven't had experience of the things that Pauline has had, so I'm tentative to say too much on this question, but I do think that I don't think the objective that the government sets out to do should be to reduce the welfare bill by sending people into psychiatric hospitals, psychiatric wards. That strikes me as crass. But I equally think that offering people the maximum level of support while they are suffering from mental health problems is a good thing. And I think that giving people the option of thinking about the way that they might be able to reintegrate into the workplace or continue to do things that they enjoy doing, whether that's directly working or volunteering or contributing to society and the economy in other ways, is a good thing as well. So I don't want to sort of dismiss this with just on the basis of a simple headline. I think it's the right sort of thing, but I wouldn't equally think we should jump into it just to make a squeeze from the welfare bill. I think
but you don't want to write people off.
No,
if
exactly.
with the right support,
exactly
they
right.
would be able to do something that they found, It can
be very empowering for them. But I'm sure that in any situation like this, and I've worked in the government, the Ministry of Justice that was responsible for prisons, and obviously finding people who are in prison ways to work while they're in prison and ways to work while they're coming out of prison. It's obviously a completely different thing from a mental health ward, but it's important that everybody in society feels able to contribute in whatever way that they can. And I think if the state can find a way to help people do that, so much the better.
Ellie?
Honestly, I'm quite gobsmacked by this proposal, and I'm a little bit surprised by the tone of the debate here from a couple of people, because I think if you just replace the word psychiatric ward with ward, I don't think we would be sending job coaches onto wards in general hospitals where people are by definition because they're ill and they need help to recover and to get better. I think we should treat mental health with the same level of importance and kind of in parallel with physical health. And so I think if you think about it in parallel with physical health,
disabilities should be able to work as well.
Well, no, of course, absolutely. But if people are in hospital, they're in hospital because they're poorly, they need treatment, they need doctors and nurses and so forth. So if we're talking about sending people into hospitals, let's send nurses into hospitals. Let's send support workers into hospitals, specialist mental health support workers into hospitals. Let's give people the support that they need outside hospital, the housing, all the rest of it, and then let's pair them up with job coaches. I mean, I'm really interested that Liz Kendall says that this is an evidence-based thing. I'm all for evidence-based policy, so let's see the evidence. But I would suspect that it's perhaps a little bit of cherry-picking, and I would like to say that if she's serious about reducing the number of economically inactive people, well, a huge proportion of the economically active population are on waiting lists, huge numbers, millions of them on waiting lists. So that's why they're economically inactive, because they're struggling to get actually the physical treatment that they need. So I think this smacks of a sort of, one of those sort of little baubles of a policy that isn't actually tackling the fundamental problems that are there in terms of investment, both in physical healthcare and also in terms of support for those with mental health needs. Because we have to recognise that for many people with the sort of mental health problems that mean they need to spend time on psychiatric wards, they need serious long-term support. They need a lot of love and care and attention and practical support like housing. Sending in a job coach It really doesn't do
I think the message is, if Liz Candle, if you're listening, we want to see the results of your experiment, because I mean, if it has produced dramatic results, I mean, who would we be to argue against this? But on the face of it, I think some of us are a little bit sceptical. Right, we'll take more of your calls and questions in just a moment. It's 8:46.
This is LBC.
Wills.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:48, Dame Harriett Baldwin, Dr. Ellie Chowns, Henry Newman and Isabel Hilton are with us. Text question here from Will in Southall. Climate scientists are warning that something called the cold blob could transform Britain's climate to make us like a Scandinavian country. What will it take for the British to wake up to this threat? Well, the lead researcher behind this new report told Andrew Marr earlier that there is a danger that the atmosphere's conveyor belt, which pushes hot air towards us, is being weakened by climate change and could shut down entirely. Well, if it means more snow, I think that's excellent news, personally. But, Ellie, what do you think?
I mean, I think, what this highlights is that climate change is not a linear process. We can't automatically assume that it's going to mean we'll get on Mediterranean and be able to grow lots of English wine and stuff like that. I think we need to be really
We kind of are already getting there, aren't we?
Well, we are. We're getting warmer and wetter, which is what climate scientists have been telling us for a long, long time. What this is saying is that if it goes too far, basically you muck about with those kind of big currents going around the Earth to such an extent that things switch the other way. And of course, that is what has happened kind of historically and sort of as climate has changed naturally. What we're seeing now with anthropogenic climate change is much, much faster, much more extreme. And so it means that we can't predict with any accuracy what's going to happen. The key thing is we know that the climate crisis is real and dangerous, and we ought to be doing everything we can. We ought to be working like Billio to reduce emissions and also to adapt to the change.
We've done better in this country than any other European country apart from Sweden.
We have to do far, 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 far more. We are still using way more than our fair share.
India needs to, Brazil needs to, America needs to. We've actually done our fair share.
No, we have not done our fair share. We've still got average emissions, around about 10 tonnes per person per year. If it was down to our fair share, it'd be less than 2 tonnes per person per year. We've got to recognise we have a massive historical responsibility in this country as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the original coal burners. Of course, we've got to work with and pressure China and these other countries to do the right thing as well. But actually, we've got
the Industrial Revolution was a good
historical...
thing. It freed people from menial labour. It freed women, particularly, from all kinds of household drudgery.
and
it helped our economy develop. It helped other countries develop. It brought with it all kinds of benefits. I think, obviously...
And an awful lot of slave labour and an awful lot of the rest of it as well. But the point is that these aren't either or.
The point is now.
There's a lot of indentured labour. I think we've got, and again, Britain led the way on slavery, and then
led the way on abolition.
Slavery clearly predated the classical world.
But we were massively part of exporting slavery.
And so were many other countries.
Around
to say that we led the way, I think, is a gross exaggeration.
Right. So I've been provoked into getting a bit too soundbitey, and I want to draw it back and just get back to this point here, that we've got to recognise that I don't think it's appropriate to say we've done our bit. We can sit back and...
Well, I'll take that back as well, because I think compared to most other developed nations, I hope you would agree that Britain has been a good performer. We may not have gone as far as you want to go, but compared to other countries, we've done well.
Relatively speaking, we have done well, but that is not through policy. That's basically through chance. No, it's basically because we moved off coal to gas, essentially.
But that was policy.
That wasn't climate policy. Right. That wasn't climate policy. It does matter, because there's so much else that we ought to do because climate is so important. We ought to be addressing food production. We ought to be addressing transport. We ought to be, when we're building new homes, hopefully we can all agree on this. If Labour's going to build 1.5 million new homes, then they should all be insulated up to the nines.
Isabel, I can tell you're gagging to get in here.
I am gagging to get in here because I think that, well, in a sense, you're both right. Nobody's done enough or fast enough, and the IEA report, which was out today, reminds us that we are way off target certainly for 1.5 and probably for 2 degrees. But it's also true that, because Mrs. Thatcher wanted to crush the coal miners, we moved off coal faster than many others, and under a Labour government we had the Climate Change Act.
She was a heroine for the Green Party.
You could argue she was a climate
She was the first leading world politician to make a speech on climate change.
She recognised climate change, but she also destroyed many people's and families and communities' lives.
But could I make the point about the science,
more
which was
closed under Labour, but still.
The question was that whether the UK would become colder. And I don't know about the cold blob, but I do track marine science. We have had a whole series of marine heat waves, particularly in the Atlantic Ocean. One result of that is that the Arctic is melting faster than anyone anticipated. The result of that is that the thing that does give us our climate, which is essentially the Gulf Stream, you transporting heat from the tropics to the northern hemispheres, is failing. And there are a lot of very worried scientists speculating on how long it'll last. If it fails, 2 things will happen. The tropics become unbearably hot, and Britain gets the climate of its latitude, which is roughly Moscow. So, hey... Read the small print on climate change, because it doesn't mean
Scandinavian winters and Mediterranean summers. I could live with that.
You won't have Mediterranean.
You don't get Mediterranean summers in Scandinavia.
No, you don't.
But what we would also get is this horrifically hot countries in the middle belt of the world.
Well, absolutely.
And the
unbearable
tropics has on people's lives and indeed on global insecurity is something we should be recognising. Climate change is a security. It's a security challenge.
Harriett.
Well, I'm obviously surrounded by people who know a lot about this and follow it very closely. So I would just make the following points. That I think the UK has made a huge effort to try and lead the world. We were the first parliament in the world to sign up to net zero by 2050. I think as a result of that leadership, 90 other parliaments have followed down that trajectory. And clearly it's both a personal responsibility but also a national responsibility to continue to make progress in this area.
Rather than the British government's leadership that's driven global action on this.
Well, clearly we're a democracy. So I think that if you look back on our history, and as Isabel was rightly pointing out, we're quite a northerly country. We used to be joined to Scandinavia, and we've had periods in the past where we've had the Thames freeze over. So, these things can fluctuate, and, certainly we need to continue with the the efforts to reduce our carbon emissions, just as a country, but also as a world.
In the mid-1970s, when I was, 12, 13, I can remember being told that we were in danger of entering an ice age, and yet 30 years on, we've got... because there must have been, if global warming exists to the extent that it does today, it must have existed in the 1970s, and yet we were told that it was going in the opposite direction then.
There was
I can't account for what you were told at school, Iain. Yeah. It was before I was born, so...
There was, also, things do fluctuate. There was a relatively short period where people were concerned about global cooling, and it does come up, but it is absolutely irrelevant.
Clearly the climate is changing globally, but I think it's also the case that, as you were saying, Iain, the UK contributes a relatively small amount of total global emissions. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. We're about 1%. So there's a danger that all of our actions are little more than virtue signalling. I'm not saying that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take action, but I think we
shouldn't stand up for human rights because it's virtue signalling.
But you just said it was 1%. So it's broadly a rounding error in the global accounting on this question. I favour action, but I also think we have to have honesty about the costs of some of the transitions that are being proposed. No, I'd like to make my point. So I think if you want to have stable, clean energy, that requires nuclear. And the Labour Party's plan to do so by 2030 basically rules out nuclear. Wind, solar, I'm in favour of them. They're good things. But people also need to be honest that balancing the grid is not included in most of the calculations when people talk about how much cheaper these energy sources are, nor are the major upgrades to the grid that is going to be required to produce wind and solar power and transmit it everywhere. And I don't think the Green Party has ever been really honest about this. They just want to click their fingers and pretend that everything's going to be okay. They don't care about the economic implications. And even when there's things like carbon capture and storage gets talked about as a great solution, the government is rightly investing some money in this, less money than actually the last government, the Conservative government, is planning to do. Green activists turn around and say, no, this might actually disincentivize people from taking action. What? I thought we were trying to solve these problems. If we can solve it through adaptation and carbon capture, great.
Can I be really clear?
Sure.
So 20 years ago, something like that, Nick Stern wrote a report for the British government on the economics of climate change.
Absolutely.
He said then, if we transition now, it'll cost roughly 1% of GDP. If we leave it 10, 15, 20 years, it'll cost 5% of GDP. Delayed action is far, far more expensive. So this argument, this completely false argument that transition, oh yes, we've got to do it, but flipping heck, it's really expensive. Actually, the
cost of not doing anything is horrendous
thing to do. It's cost effective. It's far more cost effective to transition, and the earlier that we invest,
you still have to find the money for that.
You started talking earlier on in this session. People were saying, "Oh, we're far too dependent on Chinese technology." If Britain had taken those decisions 20 years ago,
would you use nuclear?
Personally, I think we should run the nuclear stations that we've got at the minute until they stop, because it's a really expensive way of generating.
The South Koreans are building power plants in the Gulf, which are half the price of the Hinkley plants that we're building. It's a great way of getting permanent clean energy.
The cheapest thing we can do is be energy efficient.
But and that's unfortunately, the data doesn't actually show that.
If I can just finish this, that's what's driving me mad about the current government's approach to energy policy, because they talk a good game on renewables, but they are utterly failing to mention energy efficiency, which is,
but
by the way...
But if insulation paid for itself, why wouldn't people do it?
We could spend another half an hour talking about this, but we're not going to, because we've almost reached the end of the hour, but I'm going to give the final word on this subject to someone who calls himself gerrymandering in Edenbridge. Do the panel think that the Iain Dale acres should be compulsorily purchased to build a solar panel farm? Then he could speak with some authority on renewables. I'll leave that one hanging, shall I? If they want to compulsory purchase my property for a huge amount of money, who am I to say no? Right, our fun question from Kenny in Harrogate. Wallace and Gromit's evil penguin villain, Feathers McGraw, is back for the new film, which will be on TV this Christmas. Which other TV or film villains deserve a rebirth? Isabel?
I'd vote for Malcolm Tucker, actually, from the thick of it. I think if ever a man was needed at this hour.
Yeah.
Played by Alistair Campbell, of course. Harriett.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that as a child, I was only allowed to watch about 3 different programmes, and one of them was Wacky Races.
Oh, I loved that.
And so Dick Dastardly and Muttley would be my choice.
Ellie?
I love Doctor Who, so of course the villain, the Master, gets reborn all the time anyway, so I expect it to come back on our screens anyway. But the thing that struck me about this, I'm also a bit of an Andrew Scott fan, so Moriarty in the Sherlock series.
Oh, I've got a clue what you're talking about.
Moriarty. Am I pronouncing it wrong?
Yes, you were. Henry.
There we go.
Christmas classic, I guess, a James Bond, whether it's I think I prefer the old ones. Lots of different villains there to pick from. Great books to read, great films to watch. Nothing to complain about.
Jaws. Now, on Monday's panel, we have the Reform UK Deputy Leader Richard Tice, Labour's grandee, she won't like me calling her that, Emily Thornberry, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Justine Greening, and the assisted dying campaigner, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain. So they'll be with me on Monday to answer your questions. Thank you to all four of you for coming in to answer our questions today. Coming up in the next hour, Robert Jenrick, the Tory party leadership contender, has announced plans to withhold student loans for the worst performing courses in a speech today. This would lead to 130,000 fewer students going to university. Now, the money instead would go towards expanding the funding for small businesses, taking on apprenticeships for under-19s to include medium-sized businesses. He will also enable universities to become institutes of technology. So the general question I want to ask you is whether our universities, we have a fantastic university sector, it's renowned across the world, and yet I wonder whether we really appreciate it. I wonder whether Robert Jenrick appreciates it. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the UN Security Council has met to discuss the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. The permanent observer for Palestine at the UN, Riyad Mansour, claimed Israel wants to annex the territory.
400,000 Palestinians besieged and bombed and starved, left